Hi and welcome to this short tutorial about the use of focus stacking in photography, in this case landscape photography. The idea behind focus stacking is that you take multiple images of the same scene but with the focus at a different depth within the scene itself. Just to illustrate this, what I have here are 4 images of the same scene taken separately where I focused at different parts of the scene depth-wise into the actual landscape itself. So what I've got here are 4 images, stack 1, stack 2, stack 3, and stack 4 of the same scene taken near Arthur's Pass in New Zealand. In stack 1, if I were to magnify the image to full magnification at 100%, you'll notice a number of things. I've actually focused on the rocks in the foreground of the scene here. So the rocks are very sharp. In fact, you can see the cracks and the textures in the rocks itself. Now this image was taken at about f13, which you would think would actually give you a really nice deep depth of field, which means that the hill and the mountains in the background should also be sharp. But what they are isn't actually 100% absolutely sharp. In other words, a kind of sharpness that we would associate with something being in focus. What they are instead is acceptably sharp. In other words, our eyes register them as sharp simply because we don't expect absolute sharpness for things that are far away. So I'll illustrate this by scrolling up and you can look at the mountains here. So as you can see, they are not actually sharp, they're slightly off focus, even though this frame was taken at f13, which you would assume should give you maximum depth of field, maximum depth of sharpness in the image. Conversely, if I were to go to the 4th image here, which is stack 4, and I were to expand on it, magnify it, what you'll notice immediately is in this actual image here, I've actually focused on the mountain in the background and it looks absolutely sharp, it looks beautiful. However, this is also taken at f13. However, what happens now is if you look at the foreground rocks, you'll notice that they are not as defined as the foreground rocks in the first image in stack 1. And that's simply because the focus has been on the mountain, not on the rock. So there's going to be a bit of sharpness fall off where the camera actually hasn't focused on that subject or that part of the scene. So to ensure that you're able to create a photograph which has maximum absolute sharpness throughout the entire scene from foreground to background, what you need to do is actually do a focus stack. In other words, you take images, as many images as you need, where you basically shift the camera's focus from something in the foreground to something in the midground and then something in the background. So in this case, I've managed to achieve these in 4 frames. At other times, you might need only 2 or 3 frames, and at other times, you might actually need 5 or 6 frames. It really depends on what you have in the scene and how much you need in the scene in focus. So, what happens now? Essentially, what you do is you open all 4 or all of your focus stacked images in Photoshop. Then what you need to do essentially is to get Photoshop to compile and then blend the images together so that it essentially draws on all the various parts that are sharp across the images and puts them together into a single image. Now I've actually imported these 4 images into Photoshop as JPEG files. It depends on how you do your workflow for your post-production. If you're using Lightroom, you would do this slightly differently. You would actually export or open the images in Photoshop in a series of layers, so half the job's pretty much done for you. But in this case, I'm starting from scratch, so I've actually just created 4 JPEG files of the images, and I'm now going to get Photoshop to actually just basically put them together into a single image comprising of 4 separate layers, where each layer represents one of these stacked images itself. So the first thing I do is I go into File, I go to Scripts, and I'll go into Load Files into a stack. Because what I'm going to do here is get Photoshop to load all 4 images here into a stack. So I do that. Photoshop then asks me what I want to do with some of the options. Well, I want it to add the open files, because if I do open the files in Photoshop, so I'm going to get Photoshop to add these files into the stack. So it's selected stacks 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then it asks me, what do you want to do? Do I want to attempt to automatically align source images? Yes. Do I want to create smart objects after loading layers? Not necessarily. So I'll just go, okay. So what Photoshop does now is it's essentially drawing all four of these images into a separate file. It hasn't given it the title yet. That's why it says untitled up here. And it's essentially going to stack those four images as four separate layers in Photoshop. So you see it's done that. You've got the four separate layers, stack 1, stack 2, stack 3, and stack 4. And it's aligned the images quite nicely. So just to illustrate, if I were to turn off the other stacks and look purely at stack 1, which is the one where I focus on the rocks in the foreground, and I were to magnify into this so that we look at it at 100% magnification, you'll see immediately that the rocks are sharp and the mountains are not. Now if I were to turn on stack 4, which was where the mountains were in focused, and I turn off stack 1, the mountains are now sharp and the rocks in the foreground aren't. And stacks 2 and 3 basically just have the focus at a slightly different depth within the picture. So stacks 2 and 3 would basically cover for sharpness for the midground areas in the actual frame itself. So what I want Photoshop to do now essentially is to blend these images so that it's selecting all the sharp parts of from the various four images and putting them together, blending them together so that the entire image, the entire new image here is going to be absolutely sharp from foreground to background. So what I do is I'll select all four of the layers here, and the best way to do that is to select one layer, hold down the Shift key, and then select the furthest layer, and that makes Photoshop select all of them in that particular sequence. What I then do basically is go into Image, sorry, my mistake, go into Edit, and then go into Auto Blend Layers. And it's asking me, what do I want to do? I'm not creating a panorama, so I'm just going to stack the images. And I'm basically just going to select seamless tones and colors because I do want it to blend it as seamlessly as possible. And to do what we call content-aware fill of transparent areas. So if any areas doesn't actually have any content in it, perhaps just empty pixels or something along the lines of that, Photoshop will fill that up with some detail that is actually extracted from the existing images. So it's a bit like an automated fill in the gaps kind of stuff. So just click OK. So now Photoshop's blending the selected layers based purely on the content. It's selecting the sharpest parts from each of those four images, and then it's going to blend them all together by only showing the sharpest parts from each of the four images. So this takes a while. You usually go and make yourself a cup of tea, have a coffee, have a Tim Tam, watch an episode of Game of Thrones. There you go. And when you're back, Photoshop's pretty much ready for it. So you'll notice here what happens if we look at the layers down here is we still have our four images taken at different distances, focus distances in the frame itself. We've got stack 1 to stack 4. But what we have now is Photoshop's created a new layer here called stack 1 merged. So what this is it's a merged layer. Now if we were to look at this merged layer, so I'll just turn all the other ones off. If we were to look at this merged layer and magnify it to 100%, you'll notice that the mountains in the background are sharp, and so are the rocks in the foreground. Because what Photoshop has done by doing this auto merge is to actually blend together the sharpest parts from each of the four pictures to create a new picture which comprises only of the sharpest details from the four existing frames. So essentially, that's focus stacking. That's how you make sure that when you take a landscape and you want everything sharp, from something in the foreground all the way to something in the background, you have to focus stack. Simply because by shooting at a small aperture to obtain a deep depth of field, you only achieve acceptable sharpness, not absolute focus sharpness. Thanks for listening.